Sure. Thank you so much. And good afternoon, everybody. It is a pleasure to be with you. Because I work for the federal government and this is being recorded, I have something that our lawyers always ask us to do, and that is just a brief statement. This briefing is unclassified and does not represent official views of the United States government or the US State Department. All information presented today is deliberative in nature, non-attributional, and only my personal views. Okay, great. So we're done with that. That's fantastic. I wanted to let you know that I do currently work for the US State Department, specifically the Foreign Service Institute, which is the training and education arm of the US State Department. And we house a lot of our emergency management and what we call crisis management. The terms are rather interchangeable for us, but we say crisis management in the State Department, where we house our crisis management training. And so as I get started here, Dr. Otegui, if you could bring up our slideshow. Got a couple of things that are going to orient our conversation today. First of all, I did want to say to everybody who's here in the class and who's visiting, whether or not you're in the class or not, it is always such a pleasure to talk to folks that are getting ready to get into this career field, whether you're mid-career or you're just starting or you're getting ready to do things. We do not have to only talk about just this topic, which is cyber awareness and emergency management. If you have some other emergency management comments, concerns, or questions about the career field or about different things that transpire in emergency management, I am more than happy to talk about those things too. But as the doctor said, we will kind of orient this discussion around your task force. And I'm going to present to you some ideas, quite frankly. Next slide, please, doctor. To help you orient in your task force, because cyber awareness in emergency management is one of these things that we have a tendency to stay away from because it's somebody else's responsibility. One of the arguments I'm going to make for you today is that it is our responsibility as emergency managers to embrace this in many forms, right? First of all, we have to embrace our personal and organizational preparedness for cyber security, cyber awareness. We also have to kind of consider this in an evolutionary and revolutionary thinking for emergency management as it applies to cybersecurity and cyber awareness. This is going to be a practical discussion for your task force in that we're going to discuss what you can do about it as an emergency manager. And like I always like to do is give people tons of resources. So if we could go to the next slide, Doctor. What I like to do when I talk to people about these types of topics is really go through three particular kind of things. We're going to identify what we know about this topic, cyber awareness, cybersecurity, what we need to know, and how we're going to get there. That's the orientation that I'm going to use today about how we're going to fill all this in as it applies to cyber awareness and emergency management. Next slide, please. So one of the first things we have to do if we're going to talk about cybersecurity from an organizational standpoint, from your task force's standpoint, is that you have to make sure that your personal cybersecurity is in order. Are you doing the things you as an individual, you and your family, are you doing the things that you need to do cybersecurity wise? And you can get a lot of advice on this. We've been hearing this now for decades. We kind of all know what we're supposed to do, but do we really do it is the question at hand. And so what I would ask that you do after this briefing sometime today or tomorrow, take a look at ready.gov, one of my favorite all-time websites in emergency management, because FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, runs this website, and they do a really good job of telling you what to do before, during, and after events. So if you'll go to ready.gov, cybersecurity, you'll get all this great information, all kinds of different websites to go to help make yourself, your personal life, cyber prepared. Next slide, please. And we've been talking about this for a long time, right? In our lives, you know, how do you protect yourself, individually from a cyber attack? And we've all heard this, you know, we've got to keep our software up to date. We need to use strong passwords. Hopefully we use, double authentication. We're going to watch for suspicious activity. Hopefully nobody is responding to those $2 million requests from Nigeria anymore. But, obviously it still goes on. So somebody is answering those emails. So we need to watch out for things like that. using encryption, double encryption is even better, making backup files, and protecting our own Wi-Fi in our own home. We all know to do these things, but are you doing them, right? So this is not an admonishment, and this is not Rob, wagging his finger at you, but I would suggest that you put these types of things on a calendar, and then you update yourself on a monthly basis, and you just make it part of your habits and your routine, okay? So enough about personal preparedness. Go ahead, next slide, Doctor, thank you. And the reason I talk about this is because we cannot, as emergency managers and as task force members, talk about emergency management writ large unless we are prepared ourselves, right? And so I'm sure as students and as participants here in our event this afternoon, you've often seen this kind of disaster management cycle that we use a lot in emergency management. We have a disaster, something happens, and in this case, it's going to be a cyber event. And then we get into response mode, right? We answer and respond to what has just happened with that event. Eventually, it might be 1 day, 1 week, 1 year. Eventually, with an earthquake or a hurricane, it's going to be a very long recovery sometimes. Go into recovery mode. Hopefully, the things we learn in recovery help us plan mitigation better, and then we go into preparedness. And this cycle, never ends, right? It never ends. And when we talk about this cycle, hand in glove, we also talk about all hazards response. So next slide, please, Doctor. So in all hazards planning, and when we talk about natural events or man-made events or technological events, sometimes you can divide all that out. You can say chemical, biological. You can divide all these things in lots of different ways. But curiously, generally, this all hazards discussion does not include cyber. And so I want you to pause on that thought for a moment. Why is that? Why do we not include cyber in emergency management planning for these types of things? There are many reasons that we can talk about here in just a little bit, but most manuals, most emergency operations plans, most action plans, most things that go on at the city, the county, and the state level, and probably in your task force documents as well, do not include cyber in all hazards planning. So just keep that little thought out there as a future emergency manager that we need to start doing this, right? We ourselves need to be the basis for change going forward on starting to include cyber as one of our hazards. Next slide, please. Because cyber has lots and lots and lots of cascading effects. If you've never thought about it, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of secondary and tertiary orders of effects from a cyber event. And when we combine that with not having access to electricity or power, now we're really off to the races in terms of a disaster and what this does to us, because we've become such technologically dependent societies now on the internet, on the computer, on cell phones, on financial transactions, on everything we do, PayPal. Lots of people don't even touch money anymore because we transfer it, not even with a credit card, but via other means. And if we walk this out to hospitalization, we walk it out to transportation, airports, airlines, trains, our sewage system, hospitals, mortuaries, all of this depends on power. And so cyber and cyber events have tremendous cascading events. Next slide, please. And none of us have to be electricians to really appreciate what a long-term power outage could do to us. As a matter of fact, if you ask several people, ask a lot of people in Florida that go through this every year after a hurricane, or also on the Gulf Coast, or folks in Texas who just a little less than a year ago went through this in the middle of winter. A long-term power outage is a really, really, really dangerous thing. It's its own hazard, and it's its own danger to the community. And of course, if you haven't thought about power, basically there are three things going on with your power at all times. It's generation, it's distribution, and it's transmission. And all along those power lines of effort, if you will, are hundreds of vulnerabilities that are vulnerable to cyber attack. And yes, our grid is protected, but it also has lots and lots of vulnerabilities. So if you can imagine large swaths of the United States, perhaps even half or the entire country, not having access to power that would potentially be caused by a cyber event, that is a true type of Armageddon disaster that is really not the stuff of movies and not the stuff of apocalyptic novels, but it's actually something that could happen. It has happened on smaller scales, and we've had the luxury of not having to think about it on a large scale. But I would suggest to you other things going on in the world right now, especially in Eastern Europe and in other parts of the world, lend ourselves to thinking more about this type of hazard and disaster. Next slide, please. So what happens? Okay, I'm an emergency manager. I am not a cyber technical expert, but I am here imploring you to embrace cyber things more, especially in your emergency planning, because we have had the luxury of outsourcing this to technical experts most of our adult lives. What happens when we don't have access to email? Or what happens when our computers don't turn on? We go get the guy or gal down the hallway, right? It's always somebody else's responsibility to fix these things. Well, those are technical issues, and I like to say that I don't give 0 and 1s type briefings. I'm not a computer scientist. I don't want to work on computers. I have no interest in doing that. I don't have that skill. However, we as emergency managers need to do more than just call the technical experts down the hallway and expect them to always be able to fix our problems. We have to organizationally embrace this more. And I'm going to give you some revolutionary kind of leadership thinking about what we need to do to embrace this more. Next slide, please. If you will look at the types of crises, a lot of times, there's different ways of looking at this. There's hundreds of books about crisis management, emergency management, and crisis leadership. But for today's discussion, I'd like us to divide all crises, all emergencies into 2 things: routine and novel. Now, routine doesn't mean small and it doesn't mean average, but it does mean predictable. So the largest earthquake in the world that could possibly cause thousands of people to perish is still routine, in that as part of the human condition, we have dealt with earthquakes before. We know what is going to happen. They're terrible, they're awful, but we have dealt with them. And we go right into recovery mode. We have all kinds of different community plans, depending on where you live in the world, on how to deal with these things. And so hurricanes, same way, could be the largest hurricane in the world, knocks out several states, but we know what to do with it. And so it's predictable, we know how to respond. Novel crises, on the other hand, are unfamiliar to us, and we are figuring out how to deal with them in real time. Certainly, coronavirus and COVID-19 fall into this novel environment. We have dealt with pandemics and epidemics as part of the human condition for the entire history of the human race. However, what this just did to us over the course of the last 2 years was novel and was unfamiliar, and we're still dealing with it. We're figuring out how to deal with it in real time. I would submit to you that most cyber events are novel as well. Why? Because emergency managers, elected officials, folks in your task force have not thought about how we deal with it and the consequences on a macro scale, on an organizational scale, not just a personal scale, but an organizational scale. Next slide, please, Doctor. So just to review, routine things don't mean average or small. They mean that we've dealt with them before, right? Avalanches, earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, humans have dealt with these. Many of them are rapid, many of them are deadly, but they are reliable in terms of we know what's going to happen and we know how to recover because we have many plans for most of these things. And it's in our very nature to work towards their resolution, right? Recovery might be a day, might be a week, might be a year, or even longer, but we work towards the resolution. Next slide, please. Novel, on the other hand, is also rapid, but we have to innovate on the fly. We do not know how to deal with it exactly, and we are doing it under stress, right? If you remember the opening days of COVID, how stressful that was as the entire globe, all the nations in the world started dealing with this. And we are still dealing with it and have gone through various phases and various things in terms of having a vaccine, not having a vaccine. Now we might have a pill, but it's not ready yet, and on, masking, not masking, cleaning our hands before we go in somewhere, having human contact, not having human contact, all that has been novel to deal with. And a massive cyber attack or a cyber problem, because remember, it's not just attacks. We can have a cyber problem caused by a natural event as well. We could have a cyber problem generated by a large hurricane or an earthquake if we don't have access to power, right? So I'm not just saying that someone's going to attack us. That's not the only cyber problem we're worried about. However, it is very novel if we start dealing with it on a larger organizational basis. Next slide, please. So we as emergency managers have to manage expectations. We have to get involved with this and not just say, well, you know, I hope those technicians fix all these cyber problems because, wow, that's really bad. We have to start being involved and provide leadership for these novel events. There are lots of unknowns. We are what we like to say learning forward, right? It's very imperfect. It's very suboptimal environment. But we, as the emergency managers involved in this, have to help manage expectations and therefore come up with solutions. Next slide, please. Another way of looking at this is through the dimensions of uncertainty, which is just a graphic portrayal of the rate of change in the environment and the complexity of the environment. You put it on the X and the Y axis. And where we don't want to be, of course, is in that red box in the upper right-hand corner in high uncertainty, because that requires the greatest flexibility and the greatest adaptation. That is where COVID has been at, continues to be at in many, many ways. And that is certainly where a cyber event would be at, in the high uncertainty box. And so we as emergency managers, embracing the dimensions of uncertainty, need to realize that, quite frankly, we make our money, people pay us, we educate ourselves for years on end to be in the high uncertainty box, because that's the place where we are needed the most. And certainly cyber events fall into that high uncertainty box. Next slide, please. So we talked about a lot about what we know, right? What we know already. Let's talk a little bit more about what we need to know. Next slide, please. So if I've convinced you to buy into this discussion that emergency managers need to know more about cyber stuff, and you say, yeah, Rob, I'm on board, but what do I do? Okay, so we need to talk about cyber organizational preparedness. And we need to review our plans, policies, and procedures to make sure that they include cyber. This would also apply to your task force, that cyber is included in the discussions about what's going on with your task force. Also, we as emergency managers need to always have initiative, meaning we don't wait for our state, our governor, our federal government to tell us what to do about things, because our responses may be bottom-up driven. We can come up with our own solutions and start working on them for our own benefit. We should never get into the habit, especially working in a task force or working in a government type of agency or response, that we're going to wait for the higher echelon to make decisions for us and to set forth our plans, policies, and procedures. We can start inventing our own. And there's a lot of positive things that come from that. You have the opportunity to clarify roles and responsibilities, like who is doing what to whom in a cyber event, because it's not going to be just one agency. It's going to be multiple agencies, multiple levels of government. It's going to be a horizontal problem. It's going to be a vertical problem. And so having the discussion before the event helps you clarify roles and responsibilities. And then what can we do about it? Well, always in emergency management, we can have training and we can have exercising. And that helps us get to better solutions and optimizes our goals. Next slide, please, Doctor. Thank you. So just to review real quick, this is really, quite frankly, a 4-step process in terms of cyber preparedness. Step 1, we talked about. That is that solid personal preparedness throughout your organization, right? Do you have organizational training so everybody knows what they should do as an individual, right? Both in their home and in their workplace. That's step 1. Everybody's prepared. And that's why I like to use this green triangle, because the base of the triangle is always individual preparedness. That is the most important part of the preparedness triangle, and you can't get away from it. You should always pay attention to individual preparedness, especially as it pertains to cyber. So step 2 is that organizational understanding of plans, policies, and procedures for your work unit, wherever it is you work, whether it's domestically in the United States or overseas in another country. Your organization, your task force has probably written something down as it pertains to cyber preparedness. But then, like lots of emergency plans that are hundreds of pages long, oftentimes we don't take the time to read it. So in your task force, identify what has already been written and decided. Oftentimes you'll find an annex, at least, that addresses some kind of cyber stuff. A lot of times it's Annex M or Annex Q, way down at the bottom, kind of as an afterthought after the earthquake and after the hurricane, after the tornado. Oh yeah, cyber. Well, that's at least a start, right? That's at least a start. But do a quick doctrinal review of what is going on in your organization. What have you written down? What are your plans, policies, and procedures? And then you can proceed to step 3, which is understanding the threat and possible consequences as they pertain to mitigation and preparedness. What is it that you're facing? What would a cyber attack or not having power do to your organization, either operationally, financially, or even communications wise? What would those things do to your task force if you were to have a cyber event, either natural or man-made in its response? And then step 4 is, once you identify these things, coming up with a training and exercising program and then repeating that. And if you do all 4 steps, you will have that preparedness triangle as it pertains to cyber preparedness. So let's talk about each of these steps a little bit more in detail. Next slide, please, Doctor. Thank you so much. So we already talked about step 1, which was the individual preparedness. But step 2, what cyber plans already pertain to your organization? Get that and read it. So when you go to meetings and you're talking to other task force members, you're speaking with authority, you're speaking with a voice of knowledge of what has already been written down. So many times people refer to plans, they refer to things they actually haven't read. And so be the emergency manager who actually reads the plans, policies, and procedures so you can discuss them knowledgeably. So what cyber policies are in place? Sometimes they're not always in your emergency operations plan. Sometimes they're in separate annexes or memos, or the boss, the governor, the mayor, somebody has made a separate kind of thing. Make sure you get a hold of that and read it and attach it to your emergency operations plan so you know what your policies are. And then a lot of times some of the technicians, and I don't use that word loosely, I just mean the folks who are dealing with cyber from a technical point of view, have written down some procedures of what you're supposed to do if you get a malicious email, or what are you supposed to do if your computer doesn't turn on and you feel that there's been a hacking or ransomware or something like that. What are you supposed to do pre and post incident? A lot of times you can find it in these types of documents. And then, has your organization been attacked? Unfortunately, or had a cyber event? Unfortunately, many hospitals, many state governments, many federal agencies can now tell you about their experience, because a lot of folks have gone through it. And some are even starting to write after action reports and lessons learned about what not to do in the future. If any of that pertains to your task force, then get a hold of it and read it. So that's step 2. Next slide, please. So when you're analyzing the threat, a cyber threat is not necessarily really big for every organization. It depends on how you're hooked in to the community and what it is that you do. But I would suspect that a task force is very vulnerable to a cyber threat on many different levels. One is command and control, but another one is just basic communication, right? So what exactly is the cyber threat to your organization? And what are the consequences to your work unit's mission? If your task force could not communicate with itself or externally, what are those consequences? And do you have a PACE plan, right, for your communication? We say PACE when we mean primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency. Those are the 4 levels of communication we should always plan for. Does your task force have a PACE plan? is something to work through. And what are the tools in getting that done? And then what is the complexity level and the source of your threat? You know, is it the hurricane we're worried about, or is it some malicious non-state actor that we're worried about and that we're vulnerable to? There are different local and federal agencies that can help you understand this threat for your task force. They're not just in Missouri, but also within the federal government that would be more than happy to help you understand this threat better. And then what are your mitigation and preparedness plans for the identified threats? Once you identify some of those key threats, what are you going to do about it? Because it's one thing to understand a threat, it's another thing to mitigate and prepare against it. What is your task force prepared to do to mitigate cyber threats is the question at hand. So next slide, please. And so we talked about what we know, we talked about what we need to know. Now, this is my favorite part of any kind of discussion for emergency managers, and that is how we're going to get there, right? Because emergency managers come up with solutions. Next slide, please. And that leads us to step 4, which is organizational training. Does your task force right now have organizational training for cyber threats? You guys actually work this. Does your emergency operations center train against cyber threats? All right, something to ask yourself. And when we exercise, and remember, if you've never been in an exercise program before, I'll just share with you that, you know, we usually start small and we use the crawl, walk, run methodology. You know, we start off with a seminar or a workshop, and then maybe you've heard the term tabletop exercise or TTX, you know, where we literally open up our manuals and sit around a table and talk about a scenario and what we would do about it, kind of like playing chess verbally, if you will. You know, okay, this happens, so now I'm going to do this, and then this other thing happens, now I'm going to do that. You know, these are all discussion-based exercises. When you've gone through that, you can move into operations-based exercises with drills, functional exercises, and full-scale exercises. And I would submit to you that your task force even needs to do this for cyber threats, because going through drills, functional activities, functional exercises, and full-scale exercises for cyber threats are going to put you in a way better position to speed your recovery and to lessen your losses in a cyber event as a task force. And then none of this is going to work unless you put it on your organizational training calendar. Just like you would for any type of organizational training, make sure you put cyber training and cyber things on your organizational training calendar. Next slide, please. So you say to me, Rob, you know, I looked at our task force, I went through all the documents, I did all these things, and I'm sorry to tell you that we are in the worst case scenario. We have very few organizational plans and we have no training established. Well, that's okay, because it's not that hard. Don't outsource it, embrace it, take it upon yourself to make these things happen. And you can put your plans, policies, and procedures and your training into your organization yourself, because you're an emergency manager. Next slide, please. There's some people that are going to help us do this. You're never alone. And this is one of the things I love about emergency management is you're truly never alone. There's all kinds of organizations, there's all kinds of friendly people, there's all kinds of helpful things at the local, state, federal, and even international levels to help us attack the challenges that we have for especially for training and exercising. So one, look and see what your department, your task force has right now for training and exercising. If there is none, then I have 3 places for you to start. One is the Texas A&M Engineering Extension Service, known as TEEX. They work really closely with FEMA, and I'll explain a little bit more about each of these in just a moment. Then, of course, the National Cybersecurity Preparedness Consortium, which is a group of many other groups, and then the unfortunately named federal agency, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. It's quite a super mouthful with 2 securities in one title, but nonetheless, they're great people and they have tons of great resources. So next slide, please. TEEX, one of my favorite institutions. This is the extension service of the School of Engineering at Texas A&M. They partner with FEMA, and they have tons of training, by the way, not just cyber stuff, but They have tons of free emergency management training. But one of the courses that I want you to really take a look at is done concurrently with the National Consortium folks. It's called AWR 366. And this is how to build a cybersecurity annex for your emergency operations plan. So they give you free templates with the course. They have you go through the thinking that we just kind of went through in our little discussion here about what you have to do for your organization. If it doesn't apply, then don't use it. But they have all these different downloadable, executable templates, things that you just fill out. And once you start filling them out, you are literally building your own cybersecurity plan with this free course. So next slide, please, Doctor. And the National Cybersecurity Preparedness Consortium is a group like TEACS, only it actually has a lot more, and it's only cybersecurity based. And they have lots and lots of training, education, flyers, manuals on community planning for cybersecurity, because that's how they were set up, in that there is so much training available at the federal government level. One of the demands over the course of the last 5 to 7 years has been able to make this more available and more understandable at a local level, state, county, city level, down to department level, individual police departments, individual fire departments, individual public works departments. Everyone should be doing community planning for cybersecurity. And the various courses and things that are available here will help you do that. Next slide, please. And then my federal agency, CISA guys, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, they not only have a lot of free training too, but they actually have free exercises and free tabletop exercises. When you go to the critical infrastructure exercises page, there are things that you can download, adapt to your own usage, and they've taken the time to write exercises for you, so why not use them? Exercising is not rocket science. It doesn't have to be hard, but it is time consuming. And I do exercises for the State Department, and I can tell you that they are very time consuming. They require sometimes hours to write. But here you have a resource that is all set up for you and free. So please take advantage of it. A lot of different cybersecurity things. So next, and I'll show you how easy this is. Next slide, please. So maybe you download some of those things I just told you about, or maybe you don't. You can, with a little bit of creativity, simply write your own exercise. It does not have to be hard, right? And then you're really making this nexus between the emergency manager, the planner, and the cybersecurity people by thinking through some of these things. For example, Friday afternoon, it's late on Friday afternoon, one of your employees notes that they're having trouble accessing some files on your organization's intranet. You tell them not to worry about it and to go ahead and leave for the day. Okay, that's a cybersecurity kind of problem that we've dealt with before. These little bitty things, we would call our IT friends down the hallway. We'd say, hey man, we've got this problem, can you help us fix it? And they would say, sure, but you know what? It's Friday afternoon, hang on, maybe this can wait a little bit because I've got something to do. It's already 4:30. Come on, Rob, you're busting my chops. All this stuff goes on in our minds because we're human beings. All right, so next slide, please. So what do? Right? And you, as a person writing an exercise, kind of think through what would happen, right? And this is the cybernetic part of writing an exercise. What are some of my options from what just happened? I can shut down and go home for the day. I can call IT on the phone, or I can send IT a help ticket. Okay, these are just things, we made up. You can come up with other ones, and you don't even have to decide which one's right or wrong. You can talk about in your own organization, what would we do? What have we been told to do? What are we supposed to do according to our plans and procedures? And then you generate this entire big discussion on like, well, I would just go home. Well, I would call IT. Well, then now you're hitting on what you need to hit on, which is really education and training for your workforce on what they're supposed to do. Next slide, please. Now here's the nexus though. That was a technician's kind of point of view. Here's where we get into the emergency manager and advice to whoever the task force leader is, right? Pandemonium. There's pandemonium in IT. All your organization's network systems are either inoperable, down or haven't yet been turned on for the day. IT doesn't know if this is a malicious attack, an accident, or a technical issue. Regardless, every time somebody turns on their desktop computer, it becomes inoperable. Uh-oh, this is no longer just an IT department problem. This is your entire organization's problem. And the emergency manager is going to be asked to help out. Next slide, please. So we've taken this out of the domain of just a guy or gal down the hallway, and we've made it a leadership problem, which is in essence what we need to be thinking through. So you offer to help because you're a great emergency manager, and you say, hey, you ask if there's anything you can do to help. IT asks if you have a way to alert your entire organization, in this case, your task force employees, to not turn their computers on or to shut them off if they're already on. Can you do that right now? That's an interesting question, right? Because most organizations do struggle with this because like, well, how can I notify employees if I'm asking them not to turn their computers on, because the way I would do that would be through a computer, right? So do you have plans in place to notify people in another method, either via is there an alert system for their cell phones that you use for other types of emergencies, or is there some other way? So now this just became an emergency management problem and a leadership problem. It is not just a technician's problem. Next slide, please. And so, and you can disregard the text up at the top. That was for another project. But, can you alert all your employees of your task force right now? Sorry, that's not something we have the ability to do. That is actually a real answer for many organizations, right? I can use our emergency notification system, like I just mentioned, that we have loaded all employees into to send a voice and text message. That would be a great answer if that's possible for your task force. Now, I wish we could access our emergency notification system, but it's hosted on our local servers and it's inaccessible. That is the real answer for about 70% of the organizations in the world, is like, oh, our alert system is actually tied to all this stuff and we can't access it when it's down. So these are things to work through. You saw very simply, I didn't put that much time into this either, by the way, guys. You can take a cyber technician's problem and turn it into an emergency management leadership problem very, very, very quickly. And you can exercise your organization through very, very, very simple techniques and discussion. You don't have to outsource and pay a lot of money to a professional organization to exercise you. There's no reason to do that, although there are lots of services and private sector companies that would be happy to take your money to do that, but you don't need to do it because as a good emergency manager, you can do it yourself. Next slide, please. All right, so that is my discussion. As I said before, I'm Rob Fagan. I am an emergency manager for the State Department through the Foreign Service Institute. I help our employees and our organizations build resilient cultures of preparedness at the individual level and at the organization level. We train and exercise our leadership teams all over the world. I'm on the international team that works with all of our diplomatic facilities, all 180 plus of them around the globe, from 2 people to 2,000 people. We exercise, we train, and we help our employees and their families stay safe. So